A young girl in a quiet Ohio town just restored a broken military motorcycle she found buried in her family's old shed. But inside the engine, she discovered something no one expected: dog tags, a letter, and a truth hidden for over 70 years. What started as a simple repair turned into a powerful journey that gave a fallen soldier's name a second chance. This emotional story of how a girl brought history back to life through a forgotten military motorcycle will move you to your core. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. In the Rust Belt town of Denton Hollow, Ohio, where cornfields met collapsed factories and stories clung to dust like old regrets, lived a quiet 13-year-old girl named Pearl Maddox. Her world was small but heavy, raised by her great-uncle Frank in a farmhouse 2 miles from anything that mattered, where cell service didn't reach and time moved like molasses. Pearl wasn't the kind of girl you'd notice in a crowd. She rarely spoke above a whisper, kept her hair braided tight like her thoughts, and spent most of her days in a makeshift shed behind the barn, fixing what others threw away: lawnmowers, old radios, even her school principal's busted Ford alternator. She never asked for help, never needed it. What Pearl had, more than tools, was instinct. She didn't just fix machines, she listened to them. Every rattle, knock, and sputter was a secret begging to be translated. She understood silence better than most. One foggy Saturday morning, while clearing out an old grain shed to make room for hay, Pearl found something strange: a dented army green crate buried beneath burlap sacks and rotted rope. Inside was a disassembled military motorcycle engine, corroded, cracked, forgotten. Most would have walked away. Pearl didn't. She saw the scars, and she wanted to know their story. What she didn't realize was that this machine didn't just carry metal. It carried memory, and deep within its shattered frame, tucked inside a place no manual would ever mention, was something that hadn't seen light in over 50 years. A pair of dog tags, and they would change everything. Pearl dragged the crate out from under the burlap sacks with a grunt. It was heavier than it looked, and the rusted latches groaned like they were waking from a 50-year sleep. When she finally pried it open, the scent hit her metal. Oil, and something older. History. Inside lay the broken remains of a military motorcycle engine, its pistons seized, its carburetor eaten away by time. A folded maintenance log rested on top, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges. Scribbled across the top: Unit 17, Transport Division, Confidential. Pearl's hands hesitated, just for a moment. She had seen a lot of old engines, some with stories, some without. But this one felt different. She didn't know why. But something in her gut told her this wasn't just about gears and valves. That evening, Uncle Frank found her in the shed, hunched over the open crate, smudges of grease already painting her cheek. He leaned on the doorframe, his silhouette cut against the low amber of the setting sun. "That thing's seen war," he said after a long pause. Pearl didn't look up. "Why was it out there?" Frank shifted his weight. "Belonged to your great-grandfather's best friend. Brought it back from Europe after the war. Wouldn't let anyone touch it." "Why?" Frank's voice was quiet. "Because it came back without him." Pearl glanced at the engine again, its worn surfaces, the hand-stamped numbers on the side, the faint outline of a name scratched into the crankcase: J. Kessler. That night, Pearl couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the way the engine felt in her hands, like it was trying to say something. So she returned to the shed just before midnight, flashlight in hand. She began cataloging each part, laying them out gently on an old tarp, her breath visible in the cold air. That's when she noticed something strange. Inside the hollow of the engine casing, wedged deep and nearly fused with rust, was something metallic, thin, flat. She gently tapped it free with the edge of a screwdriver. It clinked to the ground, faint, almost apologetic. Dog tags? Her breath caught. She picked them up, brushing away decades of grime. The name was still legible, Kessler. James T. Blood type O. Serial 41162387. And on the back, crudely etched by hand, were 5 small words. "Tell my son I tried." Pearl froze. "Tried what?" She stared at the tags for a long time, fingers trembling. There was weight to them, not just physical, but emotional. The kind of weight that presses against your chest when the truth is too heavy to hold. The next morning, she brought them to Uncle Frank. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, he walked to a drawer in the hallway and pulled out an old black and white photograph. It showed 2 young soldiers leaning against a truck, smiling like the world hadn't yet hurt them. One was her great-grandfather. The other was clearly the man from the tags. "That's Jimmy Kessler," Frank said. "Your great-granddad and him were like brothers. He never came home. They said he went missing during a convoy attack in 1944. No body, no burial, just vanished." Pearl's mind raced. "Then how did the bike get here?" Frank shook his head. "It showed up one day after the war. No note, just the crate on the porch. Your great-granddad never talked about it, hauled it out back and never touched it again." Pearl swallowed hard. The words on the tag echoed inside her. "Tell my son. I tried." "Did he have a son?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Yeah. Tommy. He was 5 when Jimmy shipped out. Moved out west years ago. Never came back. Always said he didn't want anything to do with the military. I don't think he ever forgave the silence." Pearl stared at the engine, now half disassembled, its parts like pieces of a story finally being unboxed. She knew, then, what she had to do. This wasn't about rebuilding an engine anymore. It was about restoring a message that never made it home. For the next few weeks, Pearl worked like a girl possessed. Every afternoon after school, she was in that shed cleaning, scrubbing, grinding away rust like she was unearthing more than metal. She didn't just want it to run again. She wanted it to speak. She remachined the valves herself using an old lathe from the barn, rewired the ignition system with copper wire stripped from a broken radio, and even hand-fabricated a new exhaust bracket using scraps of fence steel. Every piece was a conversation. Every bolt she turned felt like unlocking a memory that had been sealed shut for decades. And when the final part clicked into place, she sat back, her chest tight, hands aching. Uncle Frank stepped beside her, silent, reverent. "Ready?" he asked. Pearl nodded and turned the key. At first, nothing. Then a cough, a rattle, and suddenly life. The engine sputtered, then roared, filling the shed with a growl so deep it shook dust from the rafters. Pearl didn't smile. She closed her eyes, listened, and in that moment, it felt like the machine wasn't just running. It was remembering. The motorcycle engine echoed through the fields like thunder rolling across memory. It wasn't just noise. It was grief shaking loose. Uncle Frank had to step back, blinking away tears he didn't expect. The last time that engine had roared was long before Pearl was born. Maybe even before he was born. Pearl let it run a while, the hum of it vibrating through the floorboards of the shed like a ghost announcing itself. Then she shut it off and sat in silence. She stared at the dog tags resting in her palm, their weight unchanged, but their meaning heavier now. "I think," she said softly, "this bike was trying to get home." The next morning, Pearl skipped school. She had a plan. With the dog tags in one pocket and the old maintenance log in the other, she and Uncle Frank drove 2 hours to a quiet county archive office in Bellevue. The place smelled like yellowed paper and forgotten stories. A retired veteran named Marcia ran the front desk. And when Pearl explained what she'd found, Marcia's expression changed from polite curiosity to something closer to reverence. "You say this came out of a military crate?" she asked. Pearl nodded. "Engine still works. And these were inside." She placed the tags on the counter like an offering. Marcia picked them up gently. Her eyes widened. "James Kessler," she whispered. "Unit 17. I've seen this name before." She disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with a manila folder. Aged and brittle. This was part of a forgotten series of transport records. Kessler's convoy went missing during a high-risk retrieval operation in 1944. 3 trucks, 2 motorcycles, 1 classified package, no survivors. Officially, they vanished off the map. Pearl frowned. "What kind of package?" Marcia shook her head. "That part's still redacted. But what's strange is that your logbook has the same date as the classified mission. And look here," she pointed to a smudged notation in the margin. "Secondary protocol initiated. 1 cycle redirected. Destination civilian coordinates pending." Pearl blinked. He sent the bike home. Himself. Before he died. Marcia looked her in the eye. He wanted someone to find it. Back in Denton Hollow that evening, Pearl couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. She returned to the shed after dinner, flashlight in hand. She went over every inch of the engine, tracing bolts and brackets again, running her fingers along seams and welds. That's when she noticed it. Beneath the seat bracket, hidden behind a rusted cover plate, was something odd, like a compartment. The screws were nearly stripped, and it took her the better part of an hour just to open it. Inside was a small, corroded metal tin. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 3 items. A faded black and white photo of a woman holding a small boy, dated 1943. A creased letter addressed to "Tommy, if this ever finds you." A rolled-up military patch, barely readable, but still intact. 17th Transport Division Honor, above silence. Pearl sat down, breathless. She unfolded the letter carefully, the edges crumbling slightly. "Tommy, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I needed to try. You were 5 when I left. You barely understood what deployment meant. I told you I'd come home soon. I didn't know I was lying. If this bike made it back, then maybe you'll know that I never stopped trying. I did what I had to, not for orders, but for people. The package was never gold or maps or codes. It was a girl, a French girl no older than you, hiding in a church when the bombing started. They told me to leave her. I didn't. That's why they buried my name. That's why I buried this truth here. I hope you've grown into a good man. I hope you forgive me. Love always, Dad." Pearl read it twice. Then a 3rd time. Her vision blurred. She clutched the paper like it was made of glass and electricity. This was it. The piece no one had ever found. Not even history. The next morning, Pearl made a decision. She posted a photo of the dog tags and a line from the letter to a local veterans Facebook group using Frank's account. Within 12 hours, someone responded. "My dad's name was Tommy Kessler. He died 5 years ago. He never talked about his father. Said the military never gave them answers. I'm his daughter, and I think you found our story." Pearl stared at the message, then whispered to the engine in the corner, "You made it home." Pearl couldn't stop staring at the screen. The message from Tommy Kessler's daughter sat there like a heartbeat in pixels, short, quiet, but impossibly loud inside her chest. I'm his daughter, and I think you found our story." She didn't know what to say. What could you say to someone whose entire life had been shadowed by silence? How do you hand them the truth, knowing it might both heal and hurt? Uncle Frank sat beside her at the kitchen table, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee. He hadn't said much since Pearl read him the letter out loud. "You realize," he said finally, "this story was buried for nearly 80 years. All that time, no medals, no closure. No one ever knew what that man sacrificed." Pearl nodded, still clutching the dog tags in her hand. And now, someone does. That weekend, they arranged a video call with Eliza Kessler, a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and soft features, who wore her history like an old coat. Behind her on the screen, framed on the wall, was a photo of a man Pearl recognized from the letter Tommy. When Eliza saw the dog tags Pearl held up to the camera, she pressed a hand to her mouth and just cried. Not loud, not performative, just years of quiet aching rising to the surface. "My dad never stopped wondering," she said when she could speak again. "He had dreams about engines, about being chased, about a voice calling his name but never reaching him in time. He thought it meant nothing." Pearl blinked back her own tears. It meant everything. They talked for over an hour about James Kessler, about the war, about the letter and the photograph. Eliza promised to come to Denton Hollow in person the following month, to see the bike and to hold the note that her grandfather had written but never mailed. After the call ended, Pearl didn't go back to the shed right away. She sat on the back steps of the farmhouse, staring across the cornfields swaying in the wind like a sea of golden whispers. For the first time, she saw them differently, not as something static or empty, but as pages of a story too big for any one place. She had started this journey as a girl who fixed things. Now she realized she wasn't fixing. She was listening to the echoes of people who had long since stopped speaking, not because they had nothing to say, but because the world stopped listening. She thought about that how many other machines were out there, holding pieces of people, fragments of love and loss, waiting for the right hands to bring them to life again. How many truths were rusting away in barns and sheds and attics. Pearl had never wanted attention. She didn't need recognition. But now, for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. Responsibility. Not because she owed it to the past, but because the past had trusted her to carry it forward. She walked back to the shed, slowly, purposefully. The engine sat in the center like a monument, not polished, not perfect, but alive. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded photo of James and the child he saved the girl from the church he mentioned in the letter. She pinned it to the pegboard above her workbench. Beside it, she placed a note in her own handwriting. He didn't follow orders. He followed what was right. Over the next several weeks, Pearl did something no one expected from a 13-year-old girl with a set of hand tools and a stubborn streak. She rebuilt the motorcycle, not just the engine, but the frame, the suspension, the rusted tank, the torn seat. She searched scrapyards 2 counties over with Uncle Frank. A retired military mechanic donated original schematics from his attic. The rest? Pearl figured out by instinct, measuring by feel, welding with precision, repainting in the same dull olive green it must have worn the day it left base. She didn't restore it to be pretty. She restored it to be truthful. When it was finally whole again, standing in the center of the shed beneath a single hanging bulb, Pearl didn't smile or cheer. She simply nodded, like something lost had finally come home. From that day on, Pearl kept a new journal, not for repairs, not for tools, but for stories. Engines with names, wrenches with whispers, machines that had been witnesses. And she changed how she worked, too. She didn't just restore anymore. She translated. Every nut she turned, every engine she rebuilt, it wasn't just about power or motion. It was about memory. Because Pearl Maddox had learned the most important truth of all. Sometimes the loudest voices come from the quietest machines. Pearl didn't expect anything to happen after she rebuilt the motorcycle. She thought the journey would end with the letter, the tags, the truth delivered to a family that had waited half a century for closure. But the world had other plans. It started with a photo, just one. She snapped it quietly. Without planning to share it, a soft shot of the bike beneath the barn's hanging light, dog tags gently draped over the handlebars, like a final salute. She printed it on her uncle's old inkjet and tacked it to the bulletin board at the Denton Hollow Public Library, in a corner labeled Things Worth Remembering. She didn't even put her name on it. But a week later, someone did. A local journalist covering a Memorial Day feature noticed the photo and asked the librarian where it came from. One quiet conversation turned into a 2-page spread in the Denton Gazette, with the headline, Teenager Restores, Doitoy Mash. Motorcycle unlocks hero's final message. Pearl read the article once, cringing at the attention, then tried to forget about it. But the phone in Uncle Frank's kitchen didn't. It started ringing. First, a veterans group in a neighboring town wanted to meet her. Then a teacher from a high school auto tech class asked if she'd visit and speak to his students. Then someone from the Veterans Oral History Coalition sent a letter, not digital, but typed, formal, and kind. You didn't just fix a bike. It read, You fixed what history left broken. They invited her to take part in a traveling exhibit, one that would visit schools, libraries, and community centers across the Midwest, sharing untold war stories through artifacts and restorations. Pearl's project would be the centerpiece. But there was one catch. They needed her to travel with the bike, at least for the opening leg, to tell the story, to be the voice. Pearl hesitated. For a long time. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't even sure she was brave. She just listened well. But Uncle Frank, as always, saw something she couldn't yet. You didn't find that bike by accident, he said one night. Watching her polish the tank one last time, it found you. And now the story's not just his, it's yours, too. So she said yes. They retrofitted a trailer to safely transport the bike. Pearl packed her notebook, her tools, and the folded letter she had read so many times, she now knew it by heart. The first stop was a small library in Mapleton, Indiana, where a group of middle school students sat cross-legged on the floor, staring up at her like she was something out of a storybook. She stumbled at first, stuttering, forgetting words, but then she started talking about machines, about sounds, about memory, and their faces changed. They leaned in. One girl raised her hand and asked, How did you know there was something important inside it? Pearl paused, then said, I just didn't stop listening. The librarian cried. The next stop was a community center in Illinois, where a veteran in a wheelchair rolled up to the display and whispered, That's the same model I rode escort missions on. Haven't seen one since Korea. He ran his hand gently along the leather seat like it was sacred. At another stop, a teenage boy approached her after the session. Quiet. Barely met her eyes. My grandpa left behind a box of old parts. He mumbled, We thought it was junk. But after your story, maybe it's not. Pearl handed him her email on a torn page from her journal. Send me a photo, she said. I'll help you figure it out. Each visit changed her, not just because people started seeing her differently, but because she started seeing herself differently. She wasn't just the girl in the barn anymore. She was a bridge between past and present, between silence and truth. And that power didn't scare her anymore. It grounded her. On the final stop of the first leg, Pearl was given a small token from the veterans organizing the exhibit, a handmade wooden plaque etched with the words, "In honor of those who kept driving forward and the ones who now carry the wheel." Pearl didn't cry, but she pressed her fingers gently over the grain of the wood. The way she touched rusted metal like it was speaking. And in her journal that night, she wrote something she hadn't dared write before. "I'm not just fixing things anymore. I'm giving them back to the world." By the time summer folded into fall, Pearl Maddox had crossed 5 states, spoken at 11 events, and fixed 3 more engines, none as significant as the Kessler motorcycle, but each with its own quiet history. What surprised her most wasn't how many people showed up. It was how many brought something broken. A box of letters no one could read anymore. A dented helmet found in an attic. A cracked compass from the war in Vietnam. Even a guitar missing 3 strings, carried in by a man who said it hadn't been played since his brother didn't come home from Desert Storm. Pearl didn't have answers for everything, but she had a way of listening. And for the first time in her life, people listened back. Back home in Denton Hollow, the old shed behind the barn was no longer just hers. Uncle Frank had cleared space and installed more shelves. Locals donated parts. One woman brought in a Wabupuri-era typewriter. Another dropped off a military field radio from the 50s. Pearl didn't post about any of it. She didn't need to. The story had grown beyond her hands. One Saturday afternoon, she stood in the shed surrounded by a group of kids, some from town, some from 2 counties away. They'd heard what she was doing. They wanted to learn, not just how to fix things, but how to hear them. She held up a rusted carburetor and asked, "What's this tell you?" A boy around 10 shrugged. "It's broken." Pearl smiled. "Sure. But why? What's missing? What does it sound like when it fails? What does it feel like?" They all leaned in closer. She didn't realize it yet, but what she was teaching wasn't mechanics. It was intuition. She started writing again, not just in her journal, but on the walls of the shed, chalk drawings of sound waves, arrows pointing to what each vibration might mean. She created what Uncle Frank jokingly called the language of machines. But Pearl knew it wasn't just about machines. It was about people who'd been ignored. Parts of history no one thought mattered. Emotions that had been boxed up in basements and memory. And so she kept asking new questions. Who last touched this before you? Was this left behind? Or sent? What's not here that should be? The more she asked, the more people opened up. She met a teenage girl whose grandmother had escaped Germany during the war with only a camera lens in her coat. Pearl helped her clean it, polish it, mount it in a shadow box with a photo of her grandmother smiling. "It never took another picture," the girl said, "but it helped me see her clearer." She helped a retired pilot refurbish the rusted propeller tip of his first training plane. She even received a handwritten letter from a soldier stationed overseas, saying someone in his unit had shown him Pearl's story. "I just wanted you to know," it said, "your voice reached farther than our radios do." One evening, Pearl returned to the barn after dinner and found Uncle Frank standing in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at the Kessler motorcycle. "She still runs?" he asked. Pearl turned the key. The engine came to life, low and steady, not roaring, just breathing. Frank smiled. "You know, you've changed." Pearl wiped her hands. "I guess I still hate algebra." He chuckled. "I don't mean that. You used to fix things because you liked being alone." Pearl looked at the motorcycle. "Now I fix them," she said, "so someone else doesn't have to stay broken." He didn't say anything after that. He didn't have to, because what Pearl had built wasn't just a skill or a space or a platform. It was a movement, one quiet enough to be missed if you weren't paying attention, but powerful enough to echo through every silence it touched. Autumn came softly to Denton Hollow, burning the trees in slow gold and fire. The fields emptied. The air turned sharp, and in the shed behind the Maddox farmhouse, the motorcycle still stood like a sentry. Pearl had stopped running the engine every day, not because it no longer mattered, but because she knew it had already spoken. Now, she listened for different things. Laughter from the kids in her weekend workshop. The scratch of pencil on wood as one of them diagrammed their first successful wiring loop. The slow inhale from a war widow who finally stepped inside, clutching a rusted metal watch that once belonged to her husband. Pearl had made something real. She hadn't planned it. But it grew anyway. The garage had become a quiet museum of memory, one that didn't charge admission, didn't require credentials, and didn't ask you to pretend you weren't still hurting. One Saturday morning, a letter arrived addressed to Pearl Maddox, curator of Echoes. Inside was an invitation from the State Veterans Memorial Committee. They were building a new section of the War Memorial in Columbus, and they wanted her to be part of the opening ceremony. Not as a guest. As a speaker. The thought turned her stomach upside down. Again. But she said yes, because she was no longer the girl who hid behind engine blocks and silence. She was the girl who knew how to carry voices forward. The ceremony was held on a crisp November day. Hundreds gathered, veterans with polished shoes and medals, families holding framed photographs, children too young to understand the weight of the statues towering above them. Pearl stood beside the motorcycle, cleaned, waxed, but unchanged. She didn't dress up, just jeans, boots, and her signature shop hoodie with oil stains that wouldn't come out. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage. A microphone waited. So did the silence. Pearl cleared her throat. "I don't have the right words," she began. "I only have what I heard. From an engine that hadn't spoken in decades. From a letter tucked inside a machine no one had touched. From people who kept their memories folded away because the world moved on without asking." She paused, heart pounding. But machines remember. And if we listen hard enough, so can we? She looked toward the crowd, toward Eliza Kessler, standing quietly in the front row, tears clinging to her lashes. Toward the veterans who had sent her boxes of broken radios, name tags, even a bullet-scarred field map. "Not everyone comes home," Pearl said. "But that doesn't mean they're gone. Not if we carry them. Not if we tell their stories." Then, with steady hands, she reached into her backpack, pulled out the original dog tags, and placed them on the handlebars. People stood, not in applause, in silence. The kind that meant something. The kind that held space for those who never got to finish their sentences. After the ceremony, Pearl didn't rush to leave. She walked alone around the memorial wall, reading names she didn't know, wondering what stories still waited in the dark. That night, back home, she sat cross-legged in the shed, notebook open. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote a title at the top. Case number 1006, Items with No Owners. Then, beneath it, start with the silence. Let it tell you where to look. Uncle Frank came in holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "Can't stop, huh?" he said, smiling. Pearl shook her head. "I think there are more stories out there, ones no one's ready to hear yet." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then they're lucky you're listening." Pearl smiled. "Not big, but enough." Because for the first time in her life, she didn't just believe in what she could do. She believed in why. And that made all the difference. Not all stories are told in words. Some are etched in rust, sealed inside engines, or folded quietly into the corners of history, waiting for someone gentle enough, stubborn enough, to listen. Pearl Maddox didn't set out to become a restorer of legacies. She just loved machines. But in listening to what others ignored, she uncovered something far bigger. Truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right hands to bring it back. The story of a fallen soldier. The weight of dog tags long forgotten. The voices that the world never meant to silence, but did. Pearl taught us that sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest truths, and that even the quietest listener can echo louder than a crowd. Because the world isn't short on noise. It's short on people willing to pause, willing to lean in, and truly hear what's been left behind. The end? Up next, 2 more unforgettable stories that will stay with you. Click to keep listening, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some things are too important to stay silent.